Howdy everybody. I'm walking towards the intersection right here of Northeast Davis and Grand Avenue. You go one block down and that's where a guy named Henry Loomis murdered his wife's lover in cold blood with children all around, but fortunately he didn't hit any of them. And then he booked it northbound to find his wife. Now, why am I mentioning that at this point? I've already done a video on that. Why would I be discussing an old case with you? Well, maybe because Henry Loomis lived in a house right across the street of the Oregon Convention Center, which is right here. You know who also lived right here? Literally right at this intersection behind me was a guy named John Curtis who was murdered in 1891. And that's the stage set for a new episode of Historic Murders of Portland. So way back in 1891, this intersection was known as 4th Avenue and H Street. Now, this is Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard today, but 3rd Street's on that side, Grand is one block over, and then another block over is 6th Avenue. So Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard right here is in line with 4th Avenue, and this and Grand combined it became Union Avenue for a long time. And 8th Street, that's just how the streets were going into the northern part of Portland. It was A Street, B Street, C Street, D Street, real simple like that. And then those letters were eventually each given, words. B, Burnside, C, Cooch, D, Davis. So H became Hoyt Street. So it's Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard and Hoyt Street today. But back then it was 4th Avenue and 8th Street. And there was a building here. I'm not certain what intersection it would have been at. There's obviously nothing here remotely from 1891. But at this intersection there was a place called the Harrington Rooming House. And that is where John Curtis moved into in November of 1890. So he'd been living here a couple of months. And then came April 11th. 1891. And again, nothing remotely looks the same. I can only assume that this area looked like just about every other part of Portland back in the day, which means the streets were probably lined with fairly new houses, but a lot of old beat up saloons and beat up rooming houses, places that people could come and, rent a room for $10 a month or something crazy like that. And John Curtis lived, again, the block right behind me. He worked just a couple blocks this way, 2 or 3 blocks away from where he lived, which was convenient. And before that, he'd actually worked, I don't know his exact position, but he'd worked like a stable job, working with horses and things like that. And he met a woman named Jeannie Gibbs there. He'd worked there for several years. She also worked there. And kind of, over time they became close, became friends, talked a lot. And, by 1891, according to her, they'd actually been dating very seriously and were planning on getting married soon. Now that's one side of the story. The other side of the story is that John Curtis was also seeing a woman, never got her first name, because, newspapers never like to, whenever they put a woman's name in the newspaper in the 1800s, it was always Mrs. her husband's name. So I only saw her name as Mrs. Ben West. And this was another woman that John Curtis was apparently seeing regularly. So John Curtis he's doing okay for himself. He's got a room at a rooming house. I guess it's better than being homeless. And he's reportedly seeing 2 women. Now that is that is kind of a major anchor to this overall story, because the Harrington rooming house, which again was somewhere, it was right behind me here. It's where the convention center is now. It was maybe across the street. There's Starbucks over there now. It was right here. And as a rooming house, was probably a pretty big establishment. And, you know, this is just all commerce. This is the convention center's here, the Moda Center, the Memorial Coliseum are over there, random hotels, random government buildings. That's very much what this area is now. But again, going back to my story again, channeling us back to 1891. And John Curtis is reportedly seeing 2 women. And this is verified beyond anyone's personal perspective. And I'm sorry, I just got distracted. There's a dead bird in the street, and this woman just picked it up. So she's probably deceased now. But the proprietors of the rooming house was a Mr. and Mrs. Voos, I guess. V-O-O-S. Mr. and Mrs. Voos. They had both seen each of these women, Gibbs and West, coming home with John Curtis at various different times. And at one time in particular, I actually saw him coming home with both women. So it's known that he was seeing these 2 women. And, you know, it's April 10th, 1891. John Curtis comes home to his rooming house at this intersection behind me. And, you know, it's a little bit before midnight that he comes home. A little while after he comes home, nobody sees him. They hear him on the stairs. It's presumptive. People presume he came home shortly before midnight. Mr. Voos, the male half of the proprietors of the rooming house, said they heard him come home and go up the stairs. They heard him. No one actually saw him. So we can't verify 100% exactly when he came home, but that's the story that's been peddled. Not too long after he reportedly comes home, sometime, you know, just a little after midnight, multiple people, the Vooses included, I say Voos and I feel like it's a character out of a Dr. Seuss story. Multiple people in the rooming house hear what they describe as a loud fall. Like someone fell or an object fell. And that's the only sounds that, mysterious sounds that anybody heard was this mysterious fall. Which could have been, you know, somebody knocked something onto the floor. It also could have been the sound of someone's body hitting the floor. And nobody investigates. Everyone's like, something fell, something got knocked down, whatever. Nobody investigates it, but not one person ever stated that they heard a gunshot or anything like that. And a fall and a gunshot are pretty distinct. A fall is very quick and gone sound, you know. Whereas a gunshot, there's going to be some reverberation, you know, something like that. They're comparable sounds, but they're not the same. So it's very interesting that the only thing anybody ever said they heard after John Curtis presumably came home was the sound of a fall. And that is because early the following morning, Mrs. Voos, the female half of the proprietors of the rooming house. By the way, this is right where Henry Loomis's house was, where he murdered his wife. Just throwing that in there. Miss Voos is checking rooms the following morning. So it's, you know, early morning. It's probably 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. She finishes checking the room next door to where John Curtis's room was. And as she leaves, she notices his door's cracked ajar. She steps inside, and there, near the window of his room, kind of jammed up against the side of his bed, is the dead, lifeless body of John Curtis. Now I settled myself. I'm just about a block north of where the Harrington rooming house would have been. It was getting too loud and crowded over there by the convention center. So, again, the Harrington house where John Curtis lived in, here's where 4th would have been. Like right over here is where the rooming house, you know, about a block that way. So John Curtis is found. He's been shot in the head. The bullet had settled, I believe, in the vicinity of like behind his right eye. He'd been shot, it seemed, from fairly close. There was no signs of a struggle, no signs of a scuffle, no signs of a robbery of any kind. He had just been shot in the head, and it seemed like he didn't know it was coming. There was no sign that he saw a gun or tried to fight back and save his life. So authorities didn't really know what to think of this. Was this a murder or was this a suicide? An early article I read on the case said something to the effect of, well, you know, authorities are thinking maybe it's a suicide because the dead party's kind of erratic character. Apparently he was kind of an erratic person. I found no verification of that in any other newspaper article I read. Everything else I read said he was just a normal guy. He was usually a pretty jovial guy. I think that was just some yellow journalism to kind of dramatize things and create this very sad, depressing story of this man who was just coming apart at the seams and went home one night and just shot himself. But again, we have a guy lying dead in his room. He's got a bullet wound to the head. Nobody hears a gunshot in the house. So it's very strange. I don't really know what to think of that because it would be very risky to like kill him somewhere else and then bring his body home, and there was no signs that happened anyway. There was no, you know, he didn't leave any blood. There wasn't blood on the stairs. Blood as they dragged him into as he would have been drugged into the house. Maybe someone put a bag over his head to hold the blood in. I don't know. It's just very strange that this man was shot. And he's in a rooming house. There's a room right next to him here, a room right next to him here. It's 1891. People don't just have silencers on their guns, you know, and stuff like that. And even if someone had a silencer on their gun, it still makes a little bit of noise. So it's just very, very strange that nobody heard this gunshot, and it was a very mysterious crime scene, and, you know, authorities didn't really know how to investigate it, because are we going to spend a bunch of time and money investigating a murder that may end up being a suicide the whole time? But you can't presume it's a suicide. And their answers were pretty much given to them a couple days later. There was a coroner's report done. His body was analyzed, and the coroner determined that John Curtis did in fact die as a result of a homicide. He was shot dead by somebody else. He, in analyzing the wounds and whatnot, one of the things he noticed was that there was no blood on the weapon. And, you know, he said, like, you know, if someone's going to shoot themselves, they either put the gun, they have the gun right to their skin. You know, if they shoot themselves in the temple, they do it like this. They don't, like, do it like this. You know, or they you know, it's getting dark here, but, you know, or they might put the gun in their mouth, or put the gun, like, right to their forehead. The weapon is always touching them. So there's always going to be a little blood on there, and there was no blood on the weapon, because the weapon was found in the home. Another reason that authorities thought maybe it's suicide, because theoretically, unless you're a dumb criminal, or unless you remembered to wear gloves and not put your prints on it, and you wanted it to look like a suicide, which is probably what happened, you're not going to leave the murder weapon at the scene. But again, yeah, I think they wanted authorities to think it was a suicide. So you have a guy flopped over dead in his room, the gun's right next to him. Why would a murderer leave the gun there? But beyond that, the coroner said that based on, you know, the impact of the bullet and things of that nature, that whoever shot him was likely, at the very least, 3 to 4 feet away, which, you know, an arm can get pretty long, but when you're an average-sized person, you're not going to be able to hold a gun 3 to 4, if not more, feet away from you, and why would you kill yourself that way anyway? So it became very clear that this was a murder. It was officially a murder investigation. And that's where these two women come back into play, because as far as I was able to read, this murder was never solved. They never figured out exactly who murdered John Curtis in his rooming house at 4th and H Street. You know, almost 130 years ago. About 128 and a half, if we're going to be very specific with the math. And so the only thing that people could really talk about, and it didn't seem like either of these women were considered suspects. They were more material witnesses, because they both had been seeing him. They were probably the two people that were seeing him most often leading up to the day of his death. But I'm going to tell you right now, I'm very suspicious of Mrs. West, Mrs. Ben West. Both women were interviewed in the aftermath of this shooting, as makes sense. Jeannie Gibbs, you know, there wasn't really a whole lot to say. They had according to her, been seeing each other, regularly. They were planning on getting married within the month. That was the plan. So by May 1891, they were planning on getting married to each other, and all seemed well. And she said she knew Mrs. West. Tried to be nice to her for the sake of not starting any drama. So when the Vus say that they saw John Curtis come home at least once with both women with him, that was probably both women trying to be cordial to each other and act like they liked each other, because they knew that John Curtis was somewhat close to both of them. Once I pull you away from the other woman, then I'll start trashing on her and try to get her out of our lives. So there wasn't really a whole lot to say. They got along. The last time they saw each other was April 9th. So technically 2 days. Calm down. Technically 2 days before he was murdered, because he was murdered after midnight on the 11th, but really, maybe about 30 hours before he actually died. They spent the evening together, and she wanted him to come back to her place with her, which I think she lived in this area too. Mrs. Ben West, at least at the time of the crime, was living on the west side of the river. So again, there really wasn't a whole lot to say about Jeannie Gibbs. There was nothing really suspicious about her. She was, well gathered. Nobody could verify that she'd seen him after when she said she did. There was nothing suspicious about it. And they all seemed to get along very well. But one particular detail that Jeannie Gibbs had to give, now maybe she was just saying this to benefit herself, to authorities was, me and John, we always got along great. We were going to get married. We just always had a great time together. Whereas whenever he was with Mrs. West, they were always fighting. They were always quarreling. They were always arguing. And maybe they were. And Jeannie Gibbs also told authorities that about a week before his death, John Curtis told her, and it seemed like she knew that he was kind of sort of seeing this other woman. But, if she's accurate and they were planning on getting married soon, he had to straighten up, get his act together. And according to Jeannie, he told her that he was going to tell Mrs. West, he was going to break it off with her. That was in his plans. He was going to do that. So, if Miss West is, truly enamored and in love with John Curtis and doesn't want to let him go, therein by itself is at least the seeds to suggest that she might murder him. Like, how dare you leave me for this other woman? And, Mrs. West's story is a whole different situation from Jeannie Gibbs's story. In addition to this ground laid for a potential motive that, was John Curtis going to break it off with Miss West, which might drive her to do something crazy. I don't know. I didn't meet the woman. I don't know how she'd react to a breakup. But independently of these people involved who may or may not have motivations to say certain things, Mrs. Vus, this is critical information when you're trying to think about Miss West's character. She said that, I don't know if this was, I think it was the time that John Curtis came home with both women. And according to Mrs. Vus, they were all horribly intoxicated. That was probably the only way the two women could deal with being around each other, was let's just get drunk and then at least they can deal with your existence. And Mrs. Vus was, she protested this. Don't come home all drunk like this, making a bunch of noise. This is a legitimate home. And according to Mrs. Vus, Mrs. West then pulled a gun from her pocket and pointed it at her, threatening her, and essentially telling her to back the hell off. Which means somehow, some way, I don't know how, but Mrs. West was allowed to, she had obtained a weapon of some sort. She had a weapon that she at least carried from time to time, because there she was at the rooming house, drunk, and she pulls it on the proprietor of the rooming house. I don't know how that didn't get John Curtis kicked out immediately. He brings home a woman who pulls a gun on his landlord, but Mrs. West had a potential motive to want to kill him if he was going to break up with her, and she was known, at least by one witness, to sometimes carry a gun, to have a gun on her, and she was apparently erratic with it when you look at this story. Now, of course, Miss West has the opposite story, that, he wasn't really serious about Jeannie Gibbs. He was going to break it off with her. She was the one he truly married. Miss West also claimed that John Curtis was planning on marrying her as well. And it was something they were going to do, but it kept getting delayed and kept getting delayed. And the reason it was getting delayed was because Miss Jeannie Gibbs kept sticking her nose into their business. So, of course, they're saying, completely opposite. They're saying the same thing, but essentially in opposites. They're each blaming each other for the reason they aren't getting married yet. But according to Miss West, the last time she sees, and this also makes me kind of suspicious, the last time she says that she saw John Curtis was the night before he died. So literally within probably almost less than an hour, because they were hanging in this vicinity. They met each other just a couple blocks from here. It was early evening. Miss West says that he was in a fantastic mood. He was upbeat, he was jovial, he was cracking jokes. And they went and they hung around with each other. They went to the bar that he worked at, which was literally, you see this big old Regency building here. Right in the middle of that, at the base, that's where the saloon would have been that John Curtis worked at. So Miss West says they went to his saloon, he talked to some of his work buddies, just seemed to be generally in a good mood. And then after that, they went out to dinner at a restaurant, I can only assume still in this area. And it's interesting because even Mrs. West acknowledged that by the time they got to dinner, John Curtis seemed to be kind of sullen, distracted. He wasn't talking as much, and you kind of wonder, was he getting ready to break things off with her? Why was this guy suddenly, this jovial guy, why was he suddenly silent and distracted only a couple hours before he's murdered? And so they have their dinner, and reportedly after that, they part ways. She goes home across the river, and he presumably goes back home to his rooming house. So they only part ways, again, just a little bit before he's murdered. The time in which they're seen together is much closer than when he last saw Jeannie Gibbs. And when authorities were discussing these matters with Mrs. West, she acknowledged to them, and she started crying when she did it, probably to get their sympathy. She acknowledged that she was still seeing her ex-husband, Ben West, regularly. And the reason she claimed that she was doing this was because he was supporting her financially. And people even said that she only really liked Curtis because Curtis would give her money whenever she asked for it. Even if it was his last $5. If she was like, come on, if you loved me, you'd give me the money, he'd give her the last chunk of change in his pocket. But who knows exactly. But apparently Ben West, they'd been divorced for a while, but he was still financially supporting her. So I don't know if she was unemployed or she just wasn't making enough money. She claimed that she had a lot of medical bills for her own personal condition. And she also said that she'd had 2 children from another previous marriage, a marriage before Ben West. And she'd had, I believe, 2 children, one of whom was blind. So she had medical payments she had to do in relation to her son's blindness, probably getting medicine for him, something like that. And so Ben West was giving her like $100 a month to tie her over. So she was still like spending time at his place. It was very suspicious. People wondered, authorities at least wondered, like, was she still seeing both men, or was she like, schmoozing and faking romance with her ex-husband to keep getting money? And Ben West, according to the newspapers, the main reason Ben West and her didn't work out was apparently he just hated her children. He said they were a thorn in his side, and he essentially wanted her to get rid of the kids, like put them in an orphanage or something like that, which, unfortunately, this is the late 1800s. Something like that was not unheard of, for parents to just be like, I don't want my kids anymore, drop them in an orphanage somewhere, or ditch them with some other family that would actually take care of them. And that was how their marriage broke up. And I just think, like, this guy ends up divorcing this woman because she won't get rid of her own children, one of whom is blind. Like, Ben West, real piece of work. But that has to make you a little bit suspicious that she's still seeing her ex-husband regularly, and apparently she's schmoozing money off of him. But the reason that's important, it's an important detail to know, is because that's where she was going home to after her and John Curtis split. Now, this is a very significant detail to me. I've already said a few things that might make you think, like, was Mrs. Ben West potentially the guilty party here? Again, people only say they heard John Curtis come home, so nobody's going to know for certain if he came home with Mrs. West. And apparently a little bit after this hard fall was heard, people heard someone going down the stairs, and nobody knows who it was, because, people are going up and down stairs all the time in that building. No one's going to go to the door and like, who was that going down the stairs today? So someone could have come into John Curtis's rooming house with him and left and gone completely unseen, and you have no idea who it was, whether it's Miss West or anybody else in the world. But Miss West should have an alibi because she's going home to her ex-husband's house. However, even she admitted that when she got home to her ex-husband's house, he wasn't home. She knew that he would be out. He was out, doing work. He was hanging out with some friends at a saloon, and he came home, according to the newspapers, a while after she did, at least like an hour later, it seems. However, when they talked to Ben West about this situation, Ben West says that when he came home, that his ex-wife had just arrived. He even said that when he came through the door, she was taking her coat off. Like she had been there for 10 seconds. She had barely gotten into the place before him. So why does she implicate that she got home a while before her ex-husband did, and yet when her husband gets there, she's just gotten there? It suggests to me that there's this, hour or so of time where we don't really know what happened. So she claims, Mrs. West, to have parted ways with John Curtis just a little while before he died, and then implies that it almost seems, got home across the river a little earlier than maybe she actually did. Is that because she actually stayed with John Curtis a while longer? She went upstairs with him? She had that gun on her that she carries from time to time? They show up. Maybe he's acting strange. I don't know if he's told her he's going to break it off with her yet, if he was in fact going to do that. They show up at the apartment house. They go in. No one sees him. They go upstairs. No one sees him. They get to his door. She's looking around. No one sees them. Nobody knows I'm here. They go in. Maybe they have, maybe they're just continuing their night. They're going to have a jovial conversation. And he tells her, this is over. And she snaps and she shoots him in the head. He doesn't see it coming. He never thinks that she's going to go that far and pull a gun. So there's no struggle. She just shoots him in the head. He falls dead. She thinks, oh, what am I going to do? Leaves the gun there and splits. She makes it downstairs. No one sees her. She could have pulled this murder off without anybody seeing it. So all these details considered, and her, somewhat erratic behavior afterwards, it's just suspicious demeanor, a suspicious person. I seriously question if Mrs. Ben West was not the killer of John Curtis. I can't prove it beyond all other possibilities. We don't know, but again, the case was never solved, and we are, we have what we have to work on. Now, one final note, however, if it's not Mrs. Ben West, and I don't think Jeannie Gibbs did it, there was a man staying in the room next to John Curtis's room, and because it's a rooming house, it's not a hotel, it's not an apartment. The room next door to John Curtis's room, they actually had adjoining doors. Like, you could literally go from one room into another person's room. And there was a man who was described as a transient, who was staying in the room next to Curtis's room. Apparently didn't give a name or anything. No name was ever given for this guy, so he's just a guy completely shrouded in mystery. And he was staying in the room next to John Curtis's room. And before Mrs. Voos was doing those, early morning checks on the rooms when she ultimately found John Curtis's body, she was surprised to show up at the room next door and find that this mysterious transient had already packed and booked and left. He split. Seemingly, in the middle of the night, he was just gone. Nobody, and it doesn't seem like anybody knew exactly who he was and what happened. He just bailed, split, left the hotel, maybe left town. Nobody knows, because nobody knows who this guy was. So there is this mysterious transient who was just there, and then the moment John Curtis is killed, he's suddenly gone. Didn't check out, nobody saw him, nobody knows what happened to him. So obviously, potentially, that is our murderer, and he's just a mystery man, lost to history. Nobody knows who he is. Maybe he's the killer. Who knows? Because, it wasn't a robbery. That's the thing, is, there was no real motive for a stranger to do this. His place wasn't ransacked. It seems like it's a murder where somebody he knew would have done it. Somebody who would kill him out of passion or rage or jealousy or anything like that. So, I really do kind of, in my gut, in my heart, kind of think that Mrs. Ben West probably killed John Curtis and then crept through the apartment house and then crept home. And nobody saw her, and nobody really was all that suspicious of her when all is said and done. So that's kind of my theory on this matter. But again, it still to this day is officially an unsolved murder. And that is it. That is the story, as far as I know it, of the murder in 1891 of John Curtis, bartender who, again, worked right over here, and his rooming house is right over here. It's nice when things like that are so close to each other. And, so odds are we're never going to know the full truth. Who definitively murdered this guy, or why. So as always, guys, thanks for watching. That was a detailed story. There was a lot to go through. And as always, remember to like, share, subscribe. Hit up my Patreon if you want to help me that way. Wink. And as always, from an interesting hub of commerce in northeast Portland, the convention center, the Moda Center's right over there. All these high-rises are coming up. They're all ugly as hell. But anyway, from this area, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian, and I'll see you next time.